We're going ahead with our series through Ephesians. We're on part 18, and so we're just going to continue. But I wanted to start with a real life story. So Karen and I, we've been married for 24 incredible years, right? Yes. Now we've actually been married for 26 years. No, I'm just kidding. And so no, 24 incredible years. For the first 6 or 7 years at the beginning, like we didn't have kids, and so we just had those years to focus on each other, spend time together. And then the last 17 years have been spent raising children, paying bills, just life and keeping up with church leadership. For most of this time, Karen worked as a waitress in an awesome restaurant that she loved, but it was just a very busy life. And so because of the kids and because of our church commitments and things like that, we really worked out an opposite schedule. And so, and some of you are shaking your head, you know what it is, right? And so if I was at work, she was at home with the kids. And if I was at home with the kids, she was at work, which meant that we didn't spend a ton of time together, like in free time, right? And so someone was always at work. And so I kind of developed this method of trying to, because you just do what you can to keep your relationship fun, right? And so I would develop this pattern where a couple of days a week when she was at work in the evening, I would go and I would buy flowers, and we'd find creative ways to surprise her at work with flowers or just little thoughtful pop-in hellos and just say hi to her at work with the kids and then leave. And it was really just about just taking a few minutes to make her smile, just make her feel special in the middle of a shift. And it was just a fun thing that we did a lot. Now, the reason I bring up the story is just to let you know that I'm a good husband. No, I'm just kidding. The reason I bring it up is that 90% of the time I would always go to the same store and the same florist, and these florists would always ask me, "What'd you do this time?" Right? And they were all convinced that I was in the doghouse and I was trying to get out of the doghouse. And the funny thing is that constant question, it really does, as silly as it is, it points to a deeper assumption about life. That if someone is doing something nice, they're probably just making up for doing something wrong, right? And so I just personally think that as people, we get stuck operating from a posture of paying down relational debt, right? And so if you can imagine it, it's almost like there's a hole next to us, like a sinkhole, and we're just trying to shovel dirt in and fill it, but it never actually fills. And so every statement you make, everything you do, every place you go, it's always just an attempt to throw more dirt in a hole that never fills up. And it kind of brings me to the actual problem that I want to talk about, is that we can get caught feeling like we're forever operating from a deficit with people and with God. And so if you're like me, like some of us, no matter how much we do for others, we feel like we're not doing enough. You ever feel that way? It's no matter what you do, you show up, you have dinner together, and there's that person apologizing. "I'm so sorry we didn't get together sooner," right? You call and "Oh, I'm sorry I couldn't do more." Someone gives you a gift and they're apologizing and they hand it to you "Sorry it couldn't be more." I'm well, I guess this gift sucks, right? And so it's whatever it is, we do something, but as we're doing it, we just feel like it's not enough, right? And you can just be all in on someone's problems and still feel like you're somehow letting them down. And then not just with people, some of us, no matter what we do in our walk with God, in our life of faith, we feel like it should be more. Maybe you spent 20 minutes most days in the scriptures and praying, and you're "Yeah, but I should spend an hour." And maybe you invited one person to church and they came and it was awesome, and you're "Yeah, but I've got hundreds of neighbors." Or maybe you met one person today in service and that you didn't know, and you went out to eat after service and kind of got to know them, and you're "Yeah, but look, there's just so many people that I don't know yet." Maybe you serve faithfully on one team at the church, but then you hear about another ministry that needs people, and you're "Yeah, but I'm not in that ministry as well, and I should really be more involved." Maybe you gave a gift of money. You gave to the church, and it was this sincere thing from your heart, but then you walked away feeling "I wish it could have been more." And we spend our lives like we're shoveling dirt into a hole that never gets any fuller. And so the question I want to just wrestle with for a minute is, does God really want you to feel perpetually inadequate? Because sometimes we feel like we're being holy by just beating up on ourselves. And like, yeah, but I should be doing more. I should be there earlier. I should be staying later. I should be. And so do most of your religious efforts feel like the equivalent of buying flowers for God to get out of the doghouse? And I don't know you personally, but I know myself. And I know that so often that is how I feel. Even though in my head I know the theology that tells me something different, I'm always operating from this position of relational deficit with him. And so today we're picking back up in Ephesians where we left off last week. And if you weren't with us, it was, basically we spent about 2 weeks talking about these passages where it said we should take off the old sinful way of life handed down and put on a new way of life, which is righteousness and holiness. And so we went through this and kind of in depth in the last 2 weeks and getting specific about the kinds of things that we take off and the kinds of new things that we put on. And so today, now building on top of that, we're going to push into a new direction, and we're going to share a new metaphor that the writer here gives us. And so we're going to add on top of this idea of sin avoidance and kind of growing out of the way of life handed down. And we're going to kind of take a step into what I would say is kind of a next level thought. And so I just want to say, this doesn't replace the idea of mitigating our sin. He's like, oh, well, sin doesn't matter. We're just talking like that. It's not replacing it, but it's coming in on top of it and building onto this thought. So we're going to start in chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 1 and 2, where he says, "Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God." So I want to point those 2 words out there, those 3 words. It says offering and sacrifice. Now, for a lot of us, we don't see much distinction. We're like, those are just churchy words for giving something, right? And so, but there's actually some nuance to it, and we'll dig into it. But Jesus invites us into more than just forgiveness of sins. Jesus also invites us into a life that pleases God and brings him joy. Here's the reason I say all this, because in Western culture, what we like to do is boil things down. Right? So you write a story, you do an outline. You write a paper. You guys in college you did papers and you wrote an outline. You build and so we're trained to look at things and try to boil them down to their most basic essence. And sometimes we can boil things down too far, and we lose things. And so I think a lot of us, what we've done is we've boiled down the Christian faith to simply be forgiveness of sins, hell avoidance, heaven entrance, right? And that's it. That's what really matters. And that's what my faith is founded on. But I would propose to you today that is an oversimplification, and you lose so much of what God has for you. See, if you make this all about sin elimination, then we're leaving out a lot of what God is inviting us into in this Jesus life. And then our faith, when we do that, when we boil it all the way down, our faith begins to center just on us being unworthy sinners. And we live with this constant of identity where I'm just an unworthy sinner and just saved by grace, and there's lightning bolts ready, but he's holding them back for me, and I'm super appreciative, right? You see, we often miss the component of being sons and daughters of the King of creation. So I want you to know that being a son or daughter of God is a major theme throughout Scripture. Yes, we are sinners in need of mercy. And we are also the apple of our Father's eye. And so there's these two things that we have to hold together, these two different concepts and ideas. And we shrink our faith and life in God down too far when we just make it all about sin. Like sin, forgiveness, and transformation, I want to clearly say this, are definitely part of our walk with God. We've talked about it for the last 2 weeks, but there's more. And so in verse 2, he gives this additional metaphor that we just read. And so it's like a dual metaphor, right? And so he's like, listen, there's this metaphor, there's sacrifice, and there's offering. And if we miss it, like if we kind of lump them together and turn it into one, we're missing something because there's two distinct metaphors in it. And so verse 2 tells us Jesus was both our sacrifice and a fragrant offering. And so what this is really referring back to is the Old Testament Jewish temple, and there were different functions that took place at the temple. Some of it was considered sacrifices, and some of it was offerings. And so sacrifices atoned for human sin. Right? And so there was sin that separated us from God, and the sacrifice would bring atonement, or the word, if you break it down, tells you the meaning, at one meant, right? So it was separated. Atonement brings them back together. And so the main communal one that happened once a year was called the Day of Atonement. It was this big thing that handled the sins of all the people and cleansed the temple and everything else. But on top of that, there were individual sacrifices that people made for their own personal sin. Like if they got mad and punched their neighbor in the ear, they would go and make I punched my neighbor in the ear sacrifice, and then they would feel better for their sin, right? And so whatever it was, they would make atonement for their own personal sins through these smaller sacrifices, but then there was the large collective one for everyone. And in these sacrifices, animal blood was shed as a stand-in for the punishment of people. So essentially that animal, it sacrificed itself and died so that we don't have to. And looking back through the lens of Jesus, we know now that the animal sacrifices were just a temporary solution until the sacrifice of Jesus dealt with sin and punishment on a permanent basis. And so there's in the one hand over here, there's the sacrifices. But there were also 3 different voluntary offerings in the Jewish temple that had nothing to do with atoning for sin. There was the burnt offering, the grain offering, the fellowship offering. And these things were just ways for you to commune with God. So I'll give you an example. The grain offering, if you had a great crop and you were excited about what God gave you, you're like, oh, wow, this is amazing, right? And so you would do a grain offering. You would harvest the crop. You would take some of the grain and you would bake this huge, elaborate meal. And then you would take it to the temple and you would put it on the altar and they would burn it. And that was like the symbolic way of imagining giving God a meal. Right? Like God, I made you something. It's going to be awesome. Like, check out the chives. Man, I really worked hard on those. And then as it burned, they imagined the smoke going up to God and God consuming the sacrifice. And as they did it, they even poured wine on there with it. They're like, you look thirsty, man. And so that's what they did, right? And so they would bring the food, they would bring the wine, they would burn it on the altar, and it was called a grain offering. And these offerings expressed your thanks to God. It expressed fellowship to God, devotion to God. It was really like the equivalent of me bringing Karen flowers at work. It was like, God, dude, you're the best. Here you go. I just want you to have this. Did you read the card? Right? And so, see, these offerings were really about doing something tangible that brought joy to God and created a moment of fellowship between you and God. That's what it was. Like, you saw God as your source of blessing and success. And so you wanted to find a way to tangibly express that to him. And so these offerings were just tangible ways that in your daily life you could keep God at the forefront of your mind and even at the forefront of your economic reality. And so we still do that today. I mean, people tithe and some of us give offerings, and you're doing something, you're taking from your daily economic reality and trying to present something to God like that just says, God, I'm so grateful for what you've done in my life. And so imagine it like this: if the sacrifice got you out of the doghouse with God, then the offerings were ways of adding on to the house and improving the house that you lived in with God. You were like, God, check out that new bathroom I made. Yeah. I mean, yeah, look at this. Look at the picture windows. Like, oh, windows don't belong in bathrooms. I know, right? And so that's how you would like just share joy with God. You're trying to be a blessing back to God. And so the offerings were physical expressions of your life and your interaction with God as his son or daughter in his household. And so it really was just taking internal feelings and gratitude and putting them into an action that God could experience and then other people could observe. Right? When I bought Karen flowers, it wasn't about getting out of the doghouse. It was about expressing appreciation that I had for her in actions that she could physically experience and others around her could observe. It really was just about bringing her joy. It was about making her smile. And it was a bonus if she'd like go, like tear up a little bit. You're like, all right, that was fun, right? And so what I was doing is I was just trying to gather a little bit of what she did for me that happened invisibly on the inside. And then I was trying to condense it into some silly, tangible thing and then bring it to her. And so now that you can see that is what the offerings were in the Old Testament. They were like surprising God with flowers. And so I know I'm spending a lot of time on this because we have to really get this distinction very clear or we miss the whole point of what we're doing here today. And so I think on the screens, I hope you see the distinction. Sacrifices were how you got out of the doghouse with God. Offerings were a free and voluntary expression of the joy and blessing that you felt because of God. And when you offered it up, the offering gave some of that joy and blessing back to God as your gift to him. It was like, God, you've given me this joy and blessing, and I'm going to grab some of it and give it back. And so I want you to know that Jesus filled both of those roles and functions on the cross and in his life. Jesus is the basis now of our relationship with God the Father. And so we relate to God through the framework that Jesus created. And that means that your relationship with God now takes on both of those complex metaphors. Your sin had put you in the doghouse essentially with God and with people, both circumstantially and temporarily and eternally. But Jesus is your sacrifice. He brings atonement. And Jesus is also a fragrant offering before God, bringing him joy and pleasing him. It's like the voice from heaven said as Jesus was being baptized, "This is my son, and with him I'm well pleased." And we come through Jesus to the Father. So there are components of your life before God as you follow Jesus that are just like sending flowers to heaven. And their whole purpose is to bring God joy It's to make him smile. And so, again, I want to make this clear because I don't want us to miss this. I don't want to give the impression that sin and forgiveness are not absolutely critical. That component of your relationship with God through Jesus is huge. But my concern today is that I think we often get stuck there. We go to sin and sacrifice and forgiveness, and we just keep circling that, and we miss the rest of it. The sacrifice gets you out of the doghouse so that you can live as an offering to God. Jesus paves the way for your life to be a consistent source of joy that pleases God. Like, let that sink in. The sacrifice clears away your sin so that now as you walk through your days, your life can make your Father in heaven smile. Imagine, if you would, that I owed you $1 million, right? Like $1 million. That's an old movie, sorry. And so I owe you $1 million, and I see you, and I hand you $1,000. Now, on one hand, that is $1,000 more than what you had. But it is $999,000 less than you're owed, right? So how many of you guys know if I owe you $1 million and I hand you $1,000, it's not really cause for joy or celebration, right? You might have to do the I punched him in the ear offering after that. You're like, you don't get it, buddy. And so you're not gonna be like, oh, thanks, right? But if someone else comes along right before I get there and they pay that $1 million on my behalf, then we're even. And now if I hand you $1,000, that's a real gift. It's an above and beyond blessing. And it's going to cause joy. It's going to cause celebration. You see, because Jesus is our sacrifice, he settles our debt. And now, when we live in line with what God calls us to, it comes across as an above and beyond gift that brings him joy. It's the $1,000 gift on top of the debt that was already repaid. And so then, because of Jesus, everything else that you do now that's pleasing to God above and beyond that is another gift that makes him smile. It brings him joy. And so now, having cleared up the difference between the sacrifice and the offering, let's look at this verse again. Follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself as a fragrant offering and sacrifice. And so what he's calling you to do now, what's going to be an offering before him, is you following the example of Jesus and walking in the way of love. And then just to clear it up, he goes on again in verses 3-7, and he reminds us again of all the sins that we're taking off that we talked about in the chapter before that. And he lists through them again. He's like, remember now, you're taking these off and you're putting these on, right? Because it's not either or metaphor, it's both. It's the sacrifice and it's the offering. And then in verses 8-10, he continues his thought again. And he says, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth. And then I love these last few words, and find out what pleases the Lord. So he's like, now this is your pursuit. To walk through my days and look for opportunities to give God flowers. to look for ways that I can just make him smile, to look for ways that I can please him. Because the debt has been repaid, and now you're right with God through Jesus' sacrifice. Now you're seen as loved, dearly loved children. So live in such a way as his child to bring joy to your Father. Let the focus of your life not be escaping judgment, but let's adopt a focus of pleasing God. Like if we can get our heads around this, right? So begin to plan your day around doing things that you know will make God smile. So the scripture tells us what it looks like to please God, to imitate his self-sacrificial love. So as you're going through your day, you're just looking for simple ways to love people around you in ways that look like Jesus' love. And as you do that, it's saying that it's making God smile like a proud parent. And so I'm silly, right? You guys know that by now, but I like to think that there are moments where God's up in heaven and he's watching what's going on, and it's kind of like he's sitting in the recliner like watching a football game or something, and he's just watching it, and all of a sudden you are super kind to someone that's acting like a butt. Right? And like that's a biblical term. And so you're super kind to someone that's doing that. And it makes him so excited that he jumps out of his chair. He's like, did you see that? And the angels are kind of talking to each other. So he's grabbing them. He's like, look at this. Did you see what they just did? Oh man, that's remarkable. And he's so excited that he's kind of causing a ruckus, and he's like getting everybody's attention, and he's bringing them over. He's like, look, and just look at what they did. Just look at how their life is this fragrant offering coming up before me. And so life in Jesus is so much better than just getting out of the doghouse. You get to make the God of the universe smile. Like, let that sink in. Man, when I'm walking through my day, I get to make God smile. The way I talk to this person, I get to make God smile. The way I deal with my kids, I get to make God smile. The way I forgive my spouse, I get to make God smile. The way I go above and beyond when someone's sick, when someone's hurting, and I drop them off a meal, even though they can order DoorDash, I can make God smile. And so we do this stuff not because of obligation. We're not trying to get out of the doghouse. We're trying to make our Father smile with joy and pleasure as he looks at us. And so I want to read that verse one more time because it's just so simple. And sometimes we overcomplicate spirituality. So follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. So when we walk in the way of love, we are actually imitating our Father in heaven. We're copying our dad, and that makes him smile. So when you look at the people around you, your friends, your spouse, your kids, your parents, your coworkers, your crazy uncle, who's got crazy uncles, right? We've all got crazy uncles. If you don't have one, you are the crazy uncle, right? We have that offbeat neighbor, right? We have the people who are around you right now. When we look at these people and we stop and we try to consider what's going on in their life, and then we ask ourselves, if Jesus were interacting with them right now, based on what they're going through, what would he do? And that's what it would be, to love people the way Jesus would. And that is actually what Ephesians meant when he said, find out what pleases the Lord. There's this paraphrase of the Bible, and if you don't know the differences between translations, there's a lot of people that don't. I'm probably one of them. And so there's like a million different English translations of the Bible. And just so you know, most of them are translations. They're actually going back to the original language and doing all this work and converting it into modern English. But there are things that are called paraphrases. And it's basically that someone translating the languages, they're reading the Bible and they're giving their own paraphrase. And so there's this translation called The Message, which is actually just that. There's just this guy that studied the Bible for years and years and years and then put it into his own language. And in some ways it's really interesting. And I feel like it hits it right on the head. And sometimes I think it's way off. So just so you know, but it's interesting sometimes to read it. And so I'm going to read these two verses again. So I think this is going to be like the sixth time that we've read these two verses. But we're going to read it from the Message, and I think it'll be on the screen. But it says, watch what God does and then do it. Like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. See, mostly what God does is love you. Keep company with him and learn a life of love. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us. Love like that. If you could do that, that would answer the question of find out what it looks like to please the Lord. Karen will be coming in a second, but I just want to finish with a story. When you start considering what it looks like to love people in their circumstances like Jesus would, and then you act on that, that is a life that actually pleases God. It makes him smile. It makes him grab the angels and get turned up, right? He's like, ah! And so I have a friend and his name is Sam. And many years ago, he told me this story. At this point, Sam was my friend. He had a 4-year-old son named Eli. And Sam and Eli were at the breakfast table one morning eating cereal, which already tells you, like, that's, it's not a healthy breakfast. It's okay, though. We forgive Sam. Maybe it was healthy cereal. And so they're sitting there eating cereal, and Sam's kind of doing 10 different things, and he looks over and he catches something weird. How many of you guys have ever noticed when people are moving in a weird way, it just kind of catches your attention, like even if you're doing other things? And so he's doing other things, and he's eating his cereal, and then he notices out of the corner of his eye that his son Eli is eating, but he's just doing it weird. Like he's staring very intensely at him. And then he's like moving his arm in very weird ways and taking bites and then doing it again. And so he watches him for a minute and he's like, buddy, like, what are you doing? And then Eli, his son, says, I'm trying to do it just like you, Dad. And like his heart just swelled. Like he wants to imitate me so much, even down to holding his spoon the way that I hold mine. And talk about melting your dad's heart. But listen, you give your Father in heaven such joy when he sees you trying to love people just like Jesus would. When you're looking at Jesus, like, I'm trying to do it just like you. And when you live this way, I just want you to know it sounds simple, that is some next level stuff. That's the deep end of the pool, spiritually speaking. And so I want you to know, guys, as we follow Jesus and as we do this, we're not working off a debt. There's more than just a sacrifice. This is a fragrant offering. Walking with Jesus is bigger than just getting out of the doghouse with God. You have the ability every day to make God smile. And I want you to imagine him hopping up from the chairs as you do these simple things, and he's grabbing the angels and he's pointing and he's saying, look at what they did. Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for your great love for us.